The Unsullied are some of the most terrifying warriors in the Game of Thrones universe. But let's explain how they get them to there, because this is not an easy process. It's very brutal. And it starts off with the systematic breaking of a child. From the age of 5, unsullied children are bought, castrated, and renamed with degrading terms. And this is not random cruelty. This is psychological engineering. Now, the castration, which is, to me is the worst part, but it cuts off not just reproduction, but also their hormonal basis for desire and aggression. And it makes them more manageable because it's blunting that individual desire. They're renamed. Now, this erases any link to a family or past. When you don't own your name, you don't really own yourself. And they have ritualized atrocity. Now, each unsullied child is forced to kill an infant, severing empathy in its purest form. This is textbook moral injury, a deliberate severing of consciousness so that obedience can override their natural compassion. The result is a person conditioned to exist in a permanent state of obedience and like emotional numbness. Then there's a dissociation with their own survival techniques. They aren't just emotionless by nature, they're trained into it. This constant exposure to brutality forces them to disassociate, a mental detachment from these horrors that they would, commit and also endure at the same time. Now, in modern psychology, this is seen as trauma survivors who shut off during abuse. For the unsullied, disassociation isn't occasional. It becomes their baseline mental state. And this explains why they're so calm on the battlefield. This isn't courage, but this is emotional deadness. Then they have this collective identity of the group over themselves. Their names, Grey Worm, White Rat, Red Fleet, make them just interchangeable. And this de-individualization as a concept allows them to be erased and replaced with this group identity. In psychology, this appears in cults, in the military, or mobs when the group identity becomes dominant. And the Unsullied take it even further. This is their only identity, this soldier. So without orders or a master, many of them just don't have anything. They have an emptiness where their individuality should have grown, but it's been completely repressed. And it creates this paradox of loyalty. Their loyalty looks like it's choice, but it's actually trauma bonding. Obeying isn't just duty, it's safety, because mentally for them, disobedience means chaos, pain, or death. This mirrors like real world cases of long-term captives or abused children who attach to abusers as their survival mechanism. When Daenerys frees them, quote unquote, right, their loyalty isn't gratitude for them. It's a psychological dependency shifting from one master to another master. It doesn't matter to them what their master's goal is. Freedom for them is actually terrifying because you've never had any ownership or agency of their own bodies. So they don't understand this concept of really being free. Now, we do see some glimpses of humanity. They had this desire to still have, skin-to-skin contact in a soothing way, non-sexual. And Grey Worm really stands out. I mean, he shows what happens because he starts to develop love and friendships that he is able to choose, and people are choosing him, and it starts to reopen some of these closed doors. We see him build, relationships with some of the other soldiers, and then of course there's this romance with Missandei. It's halting, it's awkward, right? It's kind of weird, very fragile, but this reflects how trauma survivors can relearn intimacy when they have someone who's caring and nurturing, as Missandei was. Now, his struggle to reconcile his desire for her with his own castration symbolizes this partial reclamation of his humanity. He can't be whole, he can't regain what was taken from him, but he can try to build something new that's very different. So his story demonstrates that even the most broken conditioning can be chipped away by human connection, or at least that's what we hope. Now, symbolically, the Unsullied aren't just fantasy soldiers. They're a mirror of real world child soldiers, slave armies, and institutionalized trauma. They embody what happens when a system of power treats humans as disposable tools. They also serve as a commentary on how discipline, when corrupted, becomes base dehumanization. And in a way, they're really one of the most tragic groups in Game of Thrones. They're not villains, they're not heroes. They're really just victims that got molded into weapons. Now, the real, if I could sum it all up in saying what they are, is these are men who were taught to kill their own innocence, who spent the rest of their lives serving as hollow shells of violence. Just horrible way to live, and it will be nice to see them gain some happiness. But, with how well they're conditioned at this stage in their life, I don't think that they ever will. There's just this interesting case looking at all the layers that make one of the most effective fighting forces that we've seen.